In the name of God who speaks life. Amen. Please be seated. Sometimes when I read the gospel as it's recounted according to John, Jesus seems sort of hard to follow. There was a scene in the West Wing when some veterans were attending a meeting in the White House. As an aside, one of them speaks to an advisor and asks if he can pull some strings at the VA to help another friend of theirs get a new wheelchair. The one he'd been using was falling apart and they weren't getting anywhere in the claims process. So this advisor took the question to the president. Did he know who should be called to get things done at that agency? The president's response was compassionate. It was certainly interesting, but it wasn't particularly helpful. He said, yeah, we've got to get things straightened up over there. And then he went on to tell a story about how the term red tape had its origins in the early days after the Civil War, when soldiers' records were bound with red tape. The advisor leaves the room, and the president's personal aide tries to stifle back a response, but President Bartlett eventually pulls it out of him. His aide says, "You know, Mr. President, that story about the red tape was really interesting and everything, but the guy just wanted a new wheelchair." Sometimes that's what it feels like hearing from John. The gospel story we hear today begins with some Greeks who have come to Philip, one of Jesus' own aides. And they say to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Word of their request winds its way through the system until it reaches Jesus, and Jesus responds with tales of grains of wheat and dying in the earth and being lifted up in new life in the stalk and bearing much fruit. Well, that's all very interesting. But what about those Greeks who just wanted to see Jesus? We never hear from them again. Did the need get met? I think if we're not careful, Christians can fall into that same trap. As people of faith, there often aren't easy answers. And there are two ways that Christians have typically responded to this through history. One way is to try to oversimplify everything, to try to reduce the Christian faith to little more than a set of moralistic rules or things on a list to be ticked off as they're accomplished. But that approach isn't one that has traditionally been satisfying for Episcopalians or others in our Anglican tradition. The Anglican way is typically to struggle, not just to find or manufacture some easy answer. But where we can fall victim is to the idea that there are never easy answers. To overthink and to complicate things even when it's not necessary. Sometimes a hungry person just needs to be fed. We can delve into the systemic roots of hunger and food insecurity sometime later, but first, just give them food. Sometimes a grieving person just needs comfort. We can explore whatever caused the grief and whether or not it's a healthy response once the immediate need has been met. But John is given to complicated responses. I once heard a biblical scholar describe the school of early Christianity that followed the gospel according to John as the first Anglicans. Perhaps these often complicated non-answers are why. Even though we could sometimes benefit from a little additional simplicity in our tradition, the fact remains that this response that is reported in the gospel is what we have. And as our Lenten observance draws to a close and we position ourselves to begin Holy Week next week, The message we hear, while probably not particularly helpful to those Greeks who just wanted to see Jesus, is helpful to us. As we prepare ourselves to look for resurrection where it hadn't been quite so obvious before, it's helpful to hear Jesus' reminder to us that signs of God's proclivity for resurrection are already all around us. It's good to have seeds, but to yield their goodness, we first have to give them up. We have to agree to lose them, to let them go down into the earth. Through the mercy of God and through the processes living in the earth, something more will come of it. But we can't have that something more until we're willing to let go of the little that we already have. The adage we've all heard is that a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. It reminds us that what we don't already hold isn't guaranteed to us. But the promise of resurrection and new life that comes from God and that we celebrate at Easter is an opposite message entirely. This message says to let go of what seems secure and to reach toward what promises to be better. It's not an easy answer. In fact, it is quite complicated. To oversimplify it, you've probably heard people say, let go and let God. That's a good slogan. It's a catchy reminder of the importance of faith. But in practice, it is decidedly more complicated than just that. Living each moment in confidence and faith that God is directing us in better ways is the goal. But it's a goal that is easier said than done. It needs to be practiced. It needs to be explored and tested, and hopefully in time it can become a pattern for us. There has to be some place between the unnecessary complication and the oversimplification. That's where we're trying to land. It's a big part of what this annual ritual of reliving the last days and death and resurrection of Jesus is about. It's about finding our place in the story and finding that our place can change from year to year and from day to day and even from moment to moment. And it's about experiencing for ourselves what we can't quite wrap our minds around. Something too complicated for a slogan, but too simple to be tied down by doctrines and treatises. It's truth that can only be lived. Because life is God's own language.